June 4, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. Non-commissioned officer Hermann Bircher gripped the ship's railing as he made his way down the gangplank, his legs still unsteady after 2 weeks at sea. The salty Atlantic air mixed with the morning haze, and before him stretched a scene that clashed violently with 3 years of Nazi propaganda. On the docks, white and black American workers labored side by side, operating massive cranes that looked decades ahead of anything he had seen in Europe. Women in coveralls ran machinery, while children hawked newspapers at the gates. Civilians moved casually around the base, unafraid, even indifferent at the sight of enemy uniforms. "Die Spinnen, die Amerikaner," he whispered to the man behind him. "The Americans are crazy." Years later, Bircher would describe this exact moment in his memoir, Behind Barbed Wire, published in Germany in 1952. It became one of the most detailed accounts of what it meant to be a prisoner of war in America. The Norfolk base itself was staggering. For 1,300 acres, docks that stretched beyond sight, cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships at once. In just one morning, this single port handled more cargo than Hamburg could process in a week. But it wasn't just the scale that stunned the newly arrived prisoners, it was the normalcy. Civilians strolled within sight of warships. Vendors sold coffee and donuts to sailors and strangers alike. A brass band played upbeat music at a nearby war bond rally. And on this summer morning, 2,500 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, the first major contingent of what would grow to 425,000 German prisoners of war held in the United States, stood in formation on American soil. What they were about to witness in the months ahead would challenge not just their loyalty to the Reich, but the very foundation of the ideology they had been raised to believe. They expected brutality, deprivation, and exploitation. Instead, they found a society so secure in its power that it treated mortal enemies like unwelcome but tolerated guests. A society whose freedoms, contradictions, and excesses proved more dangerous to Nazi ideology than any weapon on the battlefield. The processing at Norfolk began with what Bircher later called the first impossibility. In German doctrine, prisoners of war were assets to exploit or burdens to discard. The Geneva Convention was acknowledged when convenient, ignored when not. Yet here, American officers read the Geneva Convention aloud in flawless German. They explained rights. They asked about dietary needs. Records from the International Red Cross confirm that Jewish American personnel distributed Red Cross packages, calmly explaining that kosher meals were available for Jewish prisoners. Many Wehrmacht soldiers laughed nervously, thinking it was some cruel joke. It was not. Medical inspections further defied all expectations. Wounded prisoners received penicillin, the miracle drug that most German soldiers could only dream of. Swiss Inspector Guy Matreau reported in July 1943. Medical treatment provided to German prisoners equals or exceeds that given to American personnel. Prisoners expressed disbelief at the quality of care. Even more disorienting was the racial reality. African American medical technicians treated wounded German officers, something legally forbidden in Germany. Here it was simply military routine. And then came the first meal. The prisoners were led into a mess hall where American sailors and German captives ate under the same roof. The same lines, the same food, the same dining hall. At one end of the room, Americans focused more on a baseball game broadcast over the radio than on the enemy soldiers seated 50 feet away. This, more than the docks, more than the cranes, more than the lectures on rights, was the true shock. The war, for these men, had just taken on a new and most unsettling form. The train journey. From Norfolk, the German prisoners began their long journey inland. What awaited them was unlike anything they had ever experienced under wartime captivity. The trains themselves were the first surprise. Not boxcars, not cattle wagons, but passenger coaches with cushioned seats, windows, and rest stops. For men accustomed to the harsh utilitarianism of the Wehrmacht, this was disorienting. The American authorities made no effort to conceal the transport. In Germany, prisoner movements were conducted in secrecy, often at night, hidden from civilians. But here, the trains rolled through busy cities in broad daylight. At Union Station in Washington, D.C., hundreds of people gathered at the platforms. Station logs from June 1943 confirm that families saw off soldiers heading to training camps, wives kissed husbands goodbye, children waved flags, teenagers shared milkshakes in the station restaurant. Through the train windows, German prisoners watched. They were only yards away from the very society they had been taught was decadent and collapsing. The guards seemed more interested in directing traffic than watching the captives. The casual mingling of civilians and enemies left the prisoners unsettled. As the train snaked its way through the industrial Northeast, the dissonance only grew sharper. Factories loomed openly along the tracks. No camouflage, no effort at secrecy. The Glenn L. Martin aircraft plant in Baltimore displayed its name in massive letters, its parking lots full of workers' personal cars. German officers could literally count rows of B-26 bombers waiting for delivery. "Why hide?" one prisoner reportedly muttered. "They are not afraid of us seeing." The truth was unmistakable. American industry was so vast and confident that even enemy eyes posed no threat. As night fell across Pennsylvania, the prisoners saw the horizon glow orange from blast furnaces that ran without pause. Coal mines, steel mills, rail yards, all humming with energy. Workers lived not in barracks but in rows of single-family houses with gardens and electric lights. Radios sprouted from rooftops, broadcasting music into every home. At a stop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, documented in Pennsylvania Railroad records, German officers watched factory workers leaving their shifts. Men carried lunchboxes, wore leather shoes and wristwatches, and drove personal cars. One worker tossed aside a half-eaten apple and casually pulled another from his lunchbox. To German eyes, trained by scarcity, rationing, and hunger, that single gesture bordered on madness. As Hermann Bircher later recalled in his memoir, "A laborer in America wasted more in one meal than our soldiers fought over in Africa. It was not arrogance, it was abundance beyond comprehension." The journey lasted 3 days. Each mile pulled them deeper into a contradiction they could neither escape nor dismiss. A nation at war, yet unafraid. A society that wasted, yet prospered. A people who lived casually what Germans had been told was impossible. By the time the trains reached Texas, many of the prisoners were no longer thinking about the war. They were thinking about the world they had just glimpsed through the glass. Life inside Camp Hearne. After 3 days on American trains, the prisoners finally reached their destination, Camp Hearne, Texas. Built in late 1942 on 720 acres of farmland in Robertson County, the camp was designed to house nearly 5,000 German prisoners. For men who expected barbed wire, straw pallets, and squalor, the sight that greeted them seemed almost unreal. The barracks were wooden buildings with electric lights, not oil lamps. Each one had indoor plumbing, flush toilets, and hot water heaters. Every prisoner was assigned an individual bed with mattress, sheets, and blankets. Even many civilians in Germany lived with less comfort, noted Swiss Inspector Emil Sandstrom in his August 1943 report. Conditions at Camp Hearne exceed not only Geneva Convention requirements, but surpass living standards familiar to many of these men. The infrastructure alone unsettled them. There were recreation halls with ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and shelves of books. Open fields were set aside for soccer matches and athletics. There was even a camp hospital with X-ray machines, surgical suites, and supplies of penicillin, a miracle drug that was still scarce even for German frontline soldiers. But the true shock came not from the buildings, but from the policies. When the first prisoners assembled, the camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, stepped forward. He spoke to them in fluent German, a language he had studied at university before the war. He explained the rules of the camp, but also something the Germans could hardly believe. They would be allowed a degree of self-governance. Prisoners could elect spokesmen, organize their own schedules, and manage daily life within certain limits. To soldiers raised in a rigid military culture where obedience was absolute, this sounded either like weakness or a trap. But it was neither. The Americans were experimenting with something radical, allowing their enemies to practice democracy even behind barbed wire. Inside the hospital, prisoners received the same level of care as American troops. When young prisoner George Gartner developed appendicitis in September 1943, he was rushed into surgery within hours. The operation was led by Captain William Calhoun, an Army surgeon from Dallas, assisted by German prisoner medics. Gartner would survive and later become famous as the last German POW to surrender in 1985. Then came perhaps the most bewildering feature of all, the camp canteen. Here, prisoners could shop using camp currency earned through voluntary labor. Shelves offered cigarettes, chocolate, soap, stationery, even musical instruments, and art supplies. To Germans accustomed to scarcity, the idea that captured enemies could browse and choose luxuries was almost incomprehensible. By the end of 1943, as labor shortages deepened across Texas, German prisoners were sent out under guard to work in agriculture and industry. They were paid 80 cents a day in camp currency, the same as American privates earned for base pay. For the Wehrmacht men, this was the beginning of a new education, not through lectures or propaganda, but through daily life in an America that seemed both impossible and undeniable. Work beyond the camp. By late summer of 1943, the war was draining America's manpower. Farms and factories needed hands, and the War Department saw a solution in the thousands of German soldiers sitting idle behind fences. Under the supervision of the War Manpower Commission and the Provost Marshal General's office, German POWs were assigned to agricultural and industrial work across Texas. They were paid in camp currency, earned wages equal to American privates, and, most astonishing of all, they were treated not as dangerous enemies, but as temporary workers. The King Ranch. One of the first assignments took German prisoners to the King Ranch near Kingsville, Texas, a property so vast it covered more land than the state of Rhode Island. Here, the prisoners worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and black ranch hands. The casual mixing of races and labor contradicted every principle of Nazi racial hierarchy. They watched American cowboys drive cattle with trucks instead of wagons, and even with small airplanes scouting herds from above. They saw massive combines replacing dozens of workers in the fields. Mechanization on this scale was beyond anything in Europe. In their letters, carefully screened by censors, prisoners described their astonishment. One machine does the work of 50 men. Here, even the ranchers treat us more like employees than enemies. The Cotton Belt. Other prisoners were sent to work in cotton gins and mills across Texas. The Hearne Cotton Oil Mill, which used POW labor from 1943 to 1945, could process more cotton in a single day than many German mills managed in a month. What shocked the prisoners wasn't just the speed of production, but the attitude of the workers. Americans took regular breaks, ate full lunches, listened to radios while they worked, and still produced more than German laborers who lived under constant discipline and fear. Productivity through freedom, rather than punishment, challenged everything the German military had taught them. Food and waste. The most jarring encounters came in food processing plants. At the Stokely Brothers Cannery in Cameron, Texas, German prisoners were ordered to throw away mountains of vegetables, tomatoes slightly underripe, corn with uneven kernels, beans with small blemishes. Prisoners stood stunned as perfectly edible produce was discarded. In Germany, civilians fought over scraps. Here, abundance was so great that food unfit for supermarket shelves was treated as garbage. A German corporal named Friedrich Müller later wrote to his family through the Red Cross, "Today we destroyed hundreds of pounds of fruit. What would be treasure in Germany is refuse here." The American supervisor apologized for the waste. He did not realize he was apologizing for riches beyond our imagination. Free speech on the farms. Even more disorienting was the behavior of American farmers. In Germany, any criticism of the government was treason. On Texas farms, prisoners overheard landowners arguing openly with Department of Agriculture officials, even telling inspectors to go to hell over crop quotas. There were no arrests, no punishments, just arguments in broad daylight. For soldiers raised under Nazi authoritarianism, it was perhaps the most incomprehensible thing they had yet witnessed, ordinary men defying authority without fear. By the close of 1943, the Germans had seen too much to cling to the old illusions. Abundance, freedom, racial complexity, and even waste all combined to form a picture of America that propaganda had never prepared them for. And as Christmas approached, the small town of Hearne, Texas, prepared to deliver the most powerful shock yet. Christmas 1943 at Camp Hearne. By December 1943, the prisoners at Camp Hearne had settled into the strange rhythm of life in captivity. Work details took them out into Texas fields and factories, while evenings were filled with soccer matches, card games, or study in the camp library. But as the holiday season approached, the entire town of Hearne mobilized to do something no German soldier could have imagined: celebrate Christmas with their enemies. The gift packages. The local newspaper, the Hearne Democrat, printed a full list of community donations on December 23rd. Churches, schools, veterans groups, civic clubs, every organization in town contributed. 4,800 individual gift packages were collected, one for each prisoner. Schools made handmade decorations and cards. The American Legion, veterans who had fought Germans in the First World War, donated cigarettes, candy, and sports equipment. The Garden Club decorated the compound with holly and evergreens. The Lions Club sent musical instruments. The camp's central square featured a 30-foot Christmas tree, strung with electric lights that glowed all night long, using more electricity than many German villages consumed in a week. The concerts. Local church choirs came into the camp to perform Christmas music. The First Methodist Church choir even learned German carols phonetically. The director, Mrs. Sarah Patterson, had a son fighting overseas, yet she stood before enemy soldiers and led her singers through Still Nacht. For some prisoners, this was the breaking point. Hardened Afrika Korps veterans wept openly. To receive music, warmth, and kindness from a mothers of men they had fought against felt not like mockery, but a kind of strength they could not comprehend. The feast. Quartermaster records preserved the holiday menu. Roast turkey, 1 pound per man. Ham. Candied sweet potatoes. Green beans. Cornbread stuffing. Cranberry sauce. Mince pie, apple pie, and ice cream. Beer for enlisted men, California wine for officers. Each prisoner consumed nearly 5,000 calories in a single meal. At that same moment, German civilians back home were surviving, barely, on 1,200 calories a day. The emotional collapse. Guard reports from that night describe an unusual quiet in the barracks. Many prisoners stared at their gift packages or reread the cards written by American children. Some whispered prayers. Others openly admitted that the experience had shaken them more than combat. Hermann Bircher, the soldier who had once muttered that the Americans are crazy, later wrote, "These people whose sons we had tried to kill gave us presents." Their kindness was not weakness. It was the confidence of victors who knew they had already won, not just the war, but the peace that would follow. For many, Christmas 1943 marked the beginning of a transformation. The barbed wire still stood. The war was far from over. But the prisoners had glimpsed something far more dangerous to their ideology than bombs or bullets, the strength of a society rooted in generosity, not fear, education behind barbed wire. By early 1944, Camp Hearne had become more than a holding facility. It was evolving into what some later called a barbed wire college. The U.S. Army Special Projects Division had quietly launched an ambitious program, officially framed as voluntary education, but in reality, a careful experiment in reorienting the minds of enemy soldiers. The camp library. At first, the library shelves were modest, just 500 books, many donated by Hearne citizens. But by August 1944, the collection had grown to over 5,000 volumes. The American Library Association's Books for Prisoners program supplied works that were banned under the Nazi regime. Prisoners now had access to Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, works by Jewish authors such as Lion Feuchtwanger. Books that could once have earned them death sentences in Germany were freely available inside a Texas POW camp. College courses. Sam Houston State Teachers College, today Sam Houston State University, partnered with the camp to offer correspondence courses. Records show 340 German prisoners enrolled between 1944 and 1945. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and agricultural science. Professors even visited the camp to deliver lectures and administer exams. For many young Germans, this was their first taste of higher education. The camp newspaper. At Hearne, prisoners published their own paper. Die Spiegel, The Mirror, not to be confused with the later German magazine. Early issues were heavy with Nazi slogans and propaganda. But as 1944 progressed, its tone shifted. Articles began to debate democratic ideals, criticize Hitler's leadership, and reflect on American society. Copies preserved today in military archives reveal the transformation, from blind loyalty to critical thought, from ideology to inquiry. Psychological operations. Behind the scenes, American officers and immigrant German advisors were carefully analyzing the prisoners. They sorted them into 3 groups. Anti-Nazis, 10%, openly opposed to Hitler, quickly trusted with leadership roles. Non-political, 75%, ordinary soldiers, most susceptible to influence. Hardcore Nazis, 15%, resistant, often isolated to limit their sway. The strategy was subtle. Empower the anti-Nazis, expose the apolitical majority to democratic ideas, and marginalize the fanatics. Every detail was tracked: book choices, conversations, letters home, even reactions to news of German defeats. Weekly reports noted the gradual erosion of Nazi conviction. Major Maxwell McKnight, an officer at Hearne, summarized the results in late 1944. Approximately 60% of non-political prisoners show measurable movement toward democratic ideals after 6 months of exposure to American society and targeted education. For the prisoners, these changes did not feel like indoctrination. They were not forced into lectures or subjected to propaganda films. Instead, they encountered democracy in its rawest form, in books, in debates, in the freedom to think for themselves. Work, race, and everyday America. If American abundance had shocked the prisoners, it was America's racial dynamics that left them most bewildered. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as weak, corrupted by inferior races, incapable of unity. What the POWs saw in Texas was far more complex and far more disruptive to their worldview. Black guards at the gates. At Camp Hearne, soldiers from the 359th Infantry Regiment, an African-American unit, occasionally stood guard duty. 4 Wehrmacht officers indoctrinated with Nazi racial ideology, the idea of taking orders from black Americans was intolerable. Several prisoners formally requested transfers, refusing to obey Negro guards. Camp Commander Lieutenant Colonel Cecile Stiles dismissed the complaints in a December 1943 report. Objections are noted and ignored. They will comply with American regulations, regardless of personal prejudice. For the Germans, the humiliation was profound. Yet at the same time, they noticed contradictions. Inside Hearne, they had to salute black guards, but in town, those same guards were denied service at restaurants or forced to sit in segregated sections of theaters. To be treated with more freedom as enemy soldiers than black Americans had as citizens shook the prisoners' certainty about racial order. Working the fields. On Texas farms, German POWs labored side by side with Mexican-American and black workers. Under the blazing sun, categories of master race and inferior race lost their meaning. One report from the Farm Security Administration documented that black cotton pickers often outperformed the German soldiers, both in speed and endurance. For prisoners trained to believe in Aryan superiority, this daily reality was impossible to dismiss. The town of Hearne. When escorted into Hearne for supervised work or errands, German POWs sometimes sat in local cafes that refused service to black soldiers guarding them. They could buy sodas at drugstore counters where African Americans were turned away. It was a paradox they struggled to comprehend. As enemies of the state, they were granted privileges that American citizens were denied. The cultural shock. The biggest shock came not just from race, but from gender. In Germany, women were confined to supportive roles. In America, prisoners saw women driving trucks, running businesses, even flying military aircraft at nearby Bryan Army Airfield, where the Women Air Force Service pilots, WASPs, trained from 1943 to 1944. And in Hearne soda shops, German soldiers witnessed teenagers, boys and girls, laughing together, dancing to jukeboxes playing jazz and swing. Music the Nazis had called degenerate was embraced here as normal youth culture. For soldiers who had grown up in a tightly controlled, militarized society, the casual, chaotic freedoms of American life, across race, gender, and class, were as destabilizing as any battlefield defeat. As one prisoner later wrote, "We expected to see a divided, weak nation. Instead, we found a people whose strength came from what we thought was weakness, diversity, freedom, and disorder." The turning point, abundance and waste. By 1944, German POWs across Texas had seen enough of American daily life to feel its contradictions pressing in on them. But nothing challenged their thinking more than the raw, visible abundance of the United States and the way Americans treated it almost carelessly. Mountains of scrap. At the Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, German prisoners were assigned to collect metal scraps. What they saw defied belief. Every day, more aluminum was discarded as waste than German aircraft factories could acquire in a week. Sheets bent at the wrong angle, rivets mispunched, fragments trimmed from larger parts, all tossed aside, all in quantities that dwarfed the Luftwaffe's dwindling supplies. For the Germans, this was not just a factory floor. It was humiliation in material form. A single day of American waste equaled the Reich's desperate wartime needs. Food for the garbage heap. The most psychologically crushing experience came in food processing plants. At the Stokely Brothers Cannery in Cameron, Texas, German prisoners were ordered to sort vegetables for canning. What didn't meet cosmetic standards, corn with irregular kernels, beans with small blemishes, tomatoes slightly underripe, was destroyed. By the truckload. Corporal Friedrich Muller recorded in a letter preserved by the Red Cross. "Today we destroyed hundreds of pounds of fruit. Fruit that in Germany would be treasure was thrown away here." The American supervisor apologized for the waste, but he did not understand. He was apologizing for an abundance we could not even imagine. The act of discarding what Germans at home starved for was more devastating to Nazi ideology than any propaganda broadcast. It wasn't just that America had more, it was that America could afford to waste. Freedom in work. At these same plants and mills, the Germans also saw something equally destabilizing: American workers who did not fear authority. At one farm near Bryan, Texas, an angry farmer told a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell over crop quotas. The farmer faced no punishment. No secret police arrived. Life went on. Prisoners quietly compared this to Germany, where defying a bureaucrat could mean imprisonment or death. The realization: the abundance was overwhelming. The waste seemed insane. But slowly, through repetition, it became clear. This was not weakness, but strength. A society so rich it could discard food, so confident it could show its factories to enemies, so free it could allow citizens to insult officials without fear. That was a society the Nazis had never prepared them to face. Hermann Bircher later admitted in his memoir, "At first we thought the waste was madness. Later we understood it was proof. They had already won, and we had already lost." The Germans had come to America as soldiers. They were becoming something else, witnesses to a new kind of power. Re-education and ideological transformation. By mid-1944, the German POW camps in America were no longer just detention centers. They had become laboratories of the mind. Behind the fences, without lectures or loudspeakers, the U.S. military was waging a quiet war for the loyalties of its captives. Sorting the prisoners. The Special Projects Division developed a system to categorize German POWs. Anti-Nazis 10%. Outspoken critics of Hitler, often persecuted back home, quickly elevated into leadership roles inside the camps. Non-political, 75%, ordinary soldiers with no strong ideological commitments, the primary targets of American influence. Ardent Nazis, 15%, diehards who resisted any challenge to their worldview, often isolated to limit their sway. The strategy was elegant: empower the anti-Nazis, expose the majority to democratic ideas, and cut off the fanatics. Subtle observation. Army psychologists and German émigré advisors tracked every detail. They analyzed prisoners' reactions to news of German defeats, the books they checked out of the library, their participation in classes and debates, the tone of letters they wrote home. Each barracks became a case study. Weekly reports noted ideological movement, like a battlefield map, charting the slow erosion of Nazi certainty. Transformation through exposure. Unlike Nazi indoctrination, which relied on fear and repetition, the American approach was almost invisible. Prisoners weren't forced to study democracy, they lived alongside it. They read newspapers where journalists mocked their own government. They listened to radio comedians making jokes about generals and politicians. They saw civilians openly criticize President Roosevelt during wartime. They witnessed workers propose efficiency improvements in factories and be rewarded instead of punished. For men raised under totalitarian discipline, these experiences were more powerful than lectures. Measured results. Major Maxwell McKnight, whose papers are preserved at the Hoover Institution, wrote in November 1944, "The transformation rate exceeds expectations. Approximately 60% of non-political prisoners show measurable movement toward democratic ideals after 6 months of exposure." It was not propaganda that broke Nazi ideology in America, it was reality. Seeds of a future alliance. The Americans were already thinking ahead. Some prisoners were identified as potential leaders for a post-war Germany. They received advanced training in civil administration, agriculture, engineering, and public health. Long before the Marshall Plan, POWs in Texas were being prepared to return home not as broken men, but as carriers of democratic knowledge. For the Germans behind barbed wire, the war for their minds was almost invisible. But step by step, through small shocks and daily contradictions, they were being remade. As one prisoner later admitted, "They did not defeat us with speeches or threats. They defeated us with the way they lived." Returning home, from prisoners to citizens. By the spring of 1945, as Germany crumbled, American authorities began preparing their POWs for an uncertain future. The goal was not simply to repatriate them, but to send them back as seeds of a democratic Germany. Preparing for return, the War Department expanded its education programs. Vocational training. Over 31,000 POWs enrolled in trades such as carpentry, mechanics, and agriculture. Language and civics. 18,000 studied English, while thousands more took courses in American history, business, and governance. Public health and engineering. Medical staff learned epidemic control, while engineers studied infrastructure rebuilding, skills Germany would desperately need. The Special Projects Division even introduced POWs to early ideas of the Marshall Plan months before it became public policy. The numbers. By the war's end, the statistics told the story of transformation. Out of 425,000 German POWs in America, only 0.52% attempted escape, a fraction of 1%. Just 54 escapes lasted more than 30 days. 87% of eligible prisoners volunteered for labor programs. Post-war surveys showed that 74% held favorable views of American democracy and 61% supported U.S. aid to Germany. Return and influence. When repatriation began in late 1945, many POWs carried back not bitterness, but admiration. Occupation records in German archives show their influence. 48 became Bundestag members in West Germany's new democracy. 312 served as mayors or councillors. Thousands worked as teachers, engineers, farmers, and businessmen, applying American methods. One former prisoner, industrialist Hans-Georg von Studnitz, told American historians in 1965, "We returned from America with more than memories. We brought knowledge of how democracy functions, how free markets operate, how diverse peoples cooperate. We had seen the future and we knew it worked." Staying in America. Not all prisoners went home. Roughly 5,000 legally immigrated in the 1950s, most becoming citizens. Some had escaped and lived under assumed identities for years before surrendering. George Gartner, the last German POW to surrender in 1985, had built a life in California under the name Dennis whilst marrying an American woman and raising children. Others, like Hermann Bircher, immigrated legally after the war, became engineers or businessmen, and lived as Americans for the rest of their lives. Enduring bonds. The connections endured. For decades, former prisoners exchanged Christmas cards and letters with families in Hearne, Texas. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, 50 ex-prisoners returned for a reunion. They embraced old guards, visited local churches, and laid flowers at the American Legion Memorial. Fritz Zimmermann, speaking for the group, told the townspeople, "We came as enemies believing in racial superiority and national destiny. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength and that diversity creates unity." America's quiet victory. Historians now agree the German POW program in the United States was the most successful re-education effort in history. Not through coercion, not through propaganda, but through exposure to reality. Prisoners witnessed democracy functioning in apparent chaos, women exercising authority without losing femininity, racial integration advancing despite contradictions, and a society confident enough to treat its enemies with humanity. In the end, America's greatest victory wasn't won on the battlefield, it was won inside the barbed wire camps where enemies became allies simply by seeing what freedom looked like in practice. The unusual sights that had stunned them, abundance, waste, freedom, kindness, turn out not to be unusual at all. To Americans, they were simply life. To Germans trained in tyranny, they were a revelation. And from those revelations came not just transformed men, but the foundation of a new alliance, the partnership that would rebuild Germany, shape NATO, and define the post-war world. Epilogue, the most unusual sight. When the German prisoners first stepped onto American soil in 1943, they expected brutality. They expected starvation, humiliation, and a slow wasting away behind wire. What they found instead was far more unsettling, a nation that fought a world war without becoming a prison itself. They saw factories so vast that secrecy was unnecessary. They saw women and minorities in roles that Nazi ideology had declared impossible. They saw abundance treated as ordinary and kindness extended even to enemies. Most importantly, they saw democracy in action, not as theory, but as a messy, noisy, functioning reality. Newspapers criticizing the government. Politicians arguing in public. Comedians mocking generals. Citizens defying officials without fear. To soldiers raised in a dictatorship, this apparent chaos looked like weakness, until they realized it was the source of American strength. By war's end, nearly 500,000 German POWs had cycled through America. Many returned home transformed. Some stayed and became Americans themselves. Others carried back lessons that helped rebuild West Germany into a democracy aligned with its former enemy. Historians call the program the most successful re-education effort in history. But its power did not come from lectures, pamphlets, or slogans. It came from exposure to everyday life. One former prisoner summarized it best. They did not defeat us with propaganda. They defeated us with reality. The unusual sights that stunned them, electric lights burning all night, children selling newspapers at a naval base, black and white workers laboring side by side, women flying aircraft, farmers insulting government inspectors, were only unusual to eyes trained by tyranny. To Americans, they were ordinary. To Germans, they were revelations. In those revelations lay the seeds of the Marshall Plan, the Atlantic Alliance, and the democratic reconstruction of Europe. America's quiet victory in its POW camps proved that sometimes the greatest power is not destruction, but demonstration, not hate, but humanity. When German POWs reached America, it was, to them, the most unusual sight. And in that sight, they glimpsed a future where yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's allies.